Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are located. I hope your day is going well. Um, Today is February 9th, 2021, and I'd like to welcome you to the Ohio Specialty Crops team and Ohio Controlled Environment Agriculture Center virtual high tunnel school. The school, as you may know, is a live weekly seminar and discussion for current and potential high tunnel users. Excuse me. Um, Classes are held live via Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time for 1 hour from January 12th through February 16th. That totals six sessions. We are on session number 5, and with session number 5 and 6, we are transitioning a bit to content that might interest folks with a bit of experience in high tunnel use, and of course also not leaving behind in any way folks who are somewhat still new to the practice and are looking forward to what they may need to know. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. We recognize that there's a lot of competition for your time, and so we appreciate your sharing some of it with us. My name is Matt Kleinhenz. I'm a professor and extension specialist at Ohio State University. I focus on vegetable production systems, and I'm very, very pleased to join you today and to have Brad Bergefurd and other members of OSU Extension on the line with us right now. I'm going to serve as the host and moderator, and later on in the session, you'll hear from me as a speaker also. Before we get to Brad's presentation, I'd like to just remind you, for those that have been with us since the beginning of the school, you know that you currently cannot be heard or seen. In fact, nobody but me can currently be heard or seen. And that will remain true for the remainder of the session as far as a registrant. We will hear from, of course, me, and we will also hear from Brad. The best way to reach us with a question or comment is through the Q&A section of your Zoom interface, which is typically towards the bottom of your screen. You'll see a small icon there for Q&A. If you click on that, it will open up a panel in which you can type in a question or a comment. Those questions or comments are saved. And of course, we do our best during the session to respond to each and every question as it is posted. But if we do not get to your question today, please do not forget the fact that we are saving those questions, we are banking them, and we are responding to them. And you will receive, as a registrant to the school, you will receive notice as to how you can, as to where the answer to your question will be provided. So again, I'd like to remind you that you can't be seen or heard. That will remain true for the remainder of the session, but I very much encourage you to use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. So that's the best way to communicate with the host and moderator. And without further delay, I'd like to turn the session over to Brad. He'll discuss, as you see here, irrigation and fertility and four-season use, crop selection and scheduling. And I will follow with a few comments on the specifically the period known as fall to spring. So take it away, Brad.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Matt, and appreciate everybody jumping in today. I'm just glad I didn't have to drive to teach this today, because here in Southern Ohio, we don't typically get a lot of snow, and we had 8 to 9 inches, depending on where you were, come down over the night. So we're basically shut down south here. So hopefully your guys' weather's better off. But as you can see from the topic, and I was telling Matt earlier, maybe we could have broke this into 2 sessions, because over the years, we've had a lot of high tunnel workshops and trainings, and some of you that might have been involved in the past realize we can spend a day just on irrigation, and a day on fertility, and then a day on crop selection and scheduling. So hopefully we just touch on the important aspects of all those today, and then hopefully in the future we can continue this and maybe delve a little bit more deeper into it. But getting right into irrigation off the bat, because as you all know, when you're a high tunnel grower, you are playing Mother Nature. We don't have Mother Nature giving us any rainfall within that tunnel. So we have to now play Mother Nature. And this isn't in a tunnel, but this is a pretty good example of how irrigation does pay. This is one of my farmer's sweet corn fields. And you see where the corn's a lot shorter and smaller. Basically, the line was plugged right there. So that part of the field did not get any irrigation where the rest of it did. He also fertigates through his irrigation. That's where you inject the fertilizer through the drip irrigation to feed your crop on a regular basis. And again, you can tell that the crop is hurting for fertility, the crop is hurting for moisture. And so if this would happen in a high tunnel where we've just shut off the rainfall, your crops aren't going to do very well at all. So one of the keys to high tunnel production is irrigation. Irrigation is a must. If you take nothing home today, for those of you that maybe either forgot this, I forget it all the time, or maybe have not been as experienced within irrigation on your farms or in the past, just take this home. Everything's based on acre inches, at least here in the United States and Ohio. We haven't really converted to the metrics, even though a lot of us use it. When it comes to irrigation, we still speak in gallons and acres. So really the number you want to always remember or jot down, 27,154 gallons in an acre inch. Now, most of our tunnels aren't acres, but when you determine your area that you're going to be irrigating and or fertigating, you need to break that down into a per acre basis, because most of the irrigation equipment and technology we're using, the flow rates and so forth, and your injection rates are for the most part based in on a per acre basis, because a lot of the equipment we're using in tunnels is already being utilized in the field. So that may be a number you'll have to keep in mind, because the equipment is not set up or gauged for small scale tunnel production. It's gauged for the field acre production. So just remember that, and then you're just going to have to use this figure to determine your run times, determine your fertilizer amounts. Everything's based on this when it comes to irrigation and fertigation within a high tunnel. So just jot that number down. If you don't take anything else home today, at least you got that, and that is a very important number to know. So then when it comes to irrigation, really irrigation is all based on your soil type that you have in your tunnel or the media type that you're using. Drip irrigation is just about, as far as I know, all of my farmers I work with all use drip in their tunnels. Once in a while, we may get a case where you have to use some micro sprinklers to cool the crop possibly, but in terms of irrigation, most all tunnel production is under drip irrigation. So then your drip irrigation, how much, what type of lines you're using, what flow rates, all that stuff is based on the capillary movement of that water, which correlates to your soil type. So the finer the soil, the more the movement of the water. The key to irrigation is do not let those beds dry out. Your crop will actually not show drought signs for a period of time after it has already went into a drought situation. Like, for instance, a tomato crop won't really start wilting until you're probably a day too late. And you don't want to get a day too late when it comes to keeping that moisture in equilibrium within the tunnel. It's hard to play catch up, sometimes almost impossible to play catch up. So when we're irrigating in the tunnel situation, we do it frequently and often, not just once a week, not once every 2 weeks, but just about every day or every other day at least. We want to get our schedule down that we're irrigating on a frequent basis. Most of the beds that we're using for in-ground culture in our tunnels are covered with some type of mulching material, whether it's black plastic mulch, whether it's landscape fabric. Some of my growers will use straw mulch. There's lots of mulching materials. So then when you're basing your irrigation timing and your management, you need to take into consideration those mulching materials. And then when it comes to monitoring the moisture underneath those mulching materials, it's a little tougher to get and do the finger test. So we rely a lot on tensiometers, which are just soil probes that we put down at different depths, and we monitor. Due to the suction of that tensiometer, it'll give us a reading in terms of the amount of available soil moisture to that crop. There's fancy ones that you can get that have digital readouts and so forth, but some way you as a grower are going to have to manage that. Whether you do the finger test, I love the finger test. I still do that, and I'll put my finger down in there and, you know, see if you can ribbon that out and feel that moisture. There's nothing better than that, but the instrumentation really backs up those types of the finger test of monitoring our moisture. But this here slide pretty well lays it out. You know, if you have the clay soils, your water is gonna have more lateral movement on a clay soil. On a loam soil, it'll go down, but then it'll start moving out laterally. And then those of you that are farming on sand know that water goes straight on down, and it's hard to get that lateral movement when your soil base has a sand structure to it. So there's where you'll have to know your soil types, try to guess what that lateral movement of water and moisture could be, and then you will base your purchase of your, you know, whether you're using high flow rates, low flow rates, whether you're having emitter spacings that are closer or further apart. I would suggest you can do it yourselves. There's a lot of good information out there on drip irrigation, but you know, if you have a local drip irrigation engineer or a supply company, they can offer a lot of these services for free. They're engineers. They know how to design these systems, and you know, working with an irrigation engineer, they can save you a lot of money in terms of maybe you buy things that you really aren't going to need in terms of the system setup, or they can set you up with a system that's not going to cost you money in the long run because you weren't able to get enough moisture. You weren't able to get enough irrigation. You weren't able to get that fertility to the crop, and therefore you're going to lose yield. So again, want to hit home number two, besides the gallonage per acre inch of water, never let your media dry out. And I know I got lots of farmers, and I'm a farmer myself. We used to have a lot of high tunnels, and we also grew field vegetables. When you get into picking sweet corn, harvesting cantaloupe, it's easy to forget about the crops growing in the tunnel, but it's very easy when you hit into June and May and July for that soil to dry out very fast, and you need to manage that and do not let it dry out. Once you let it dry out, it's going to be a bear to try to get it caught back up to the amount that crop's going to need. So again, this is just a typical drip system layout. This is in a field situation, but it really doesn't matter whether it's field, whether it's tunnel. Just take this that we have here for field, and then just squish your way down for your high tunnel setup. You're going to need a basic water. We'll go over it a little bit, but really visually you can see where all the components that are required. And again, remember, this is for a field setup, but it really doesn't matter whether it's field or whether it's high tunnel. Your typical irrigation design is going to be the same type of format that we see here. Those of you that maybe haven't used drip irrigation, this is just one type. There's irrigation tubes, there's all different brands of irrigation, drip irrigation tape. And again, this is how we pull it out in the fields on our sweet corn and so forth. But it just comes in these big rolls, and you can just roll it out in the tunnels. Some folks will even take it back up. But it's a very cheap product, and it's not really made for multiple uses unless you get the heavier gauge material. But for the most part, we get 1 year's use out of it, and then we go ahead and put down all new irrigation tape. So the basic irrigation components we're going to be talking about is you got to have a water source, right? So really, before you build these tunnels, make sure you have a good water source. You're going to need it. I've heard a couple horror stories. Folks get some funding to build a high tunnel. They build it, then they're playing catch up. They find out they don't have enough water to water the size of tunnel that they built. Might have been relying on a pond, might have been relying on a well there at the house or at the barn. And once they started doing that math with that per acre inch, and then once they actually start even growing a crop in there, it takes a lot of water. It really does. And again, it depends on your soil type and the crop and so forth, but you go through a lot of water. So again, before you build these, figure out your production area, what type of crops you're going to be growing. And again, we don't rely on any moisture from Mother Nature. We're doing it all ourselves because we've shut the rainfall off. So worst case scenario, determine how many gallons you'll need for a season and go from there. Don't build the structure and then run into a problem not having a strong enough water source. We like backflow preventers, especially if you're using a well, if you're using city water, municipal water, whatever. But we're going to go through the supply line, regulator, filters and filtration, an injector to inject your fertilizer. Pressure gauges are a must. All of these drip irrigation components run on very low pressure, which makes this type of system much better than a high pressure overhead system. So you need pressure gauges throughout the system in order to make sure we're not going to be blowing lines. If you blow those drip irrigation tape that are underneath the ground, you're going to be sunk because there's really no way to go ahead and pull those back out, because they'll split right out if you increase that pressure beyond what it was manufactured for. What is cool today compared to when we started some high tunnel work back 25 years ago was today there's actually battery operated timers and a solenoid system that runs on batteries that you can pretty well set that. Say you get busy with sweet corn harvest or melon harvest, and maybe you're not going to have an eye on that tunnel as much as you should. We can actually have these water systems kick on and off on their own. Now, just like everything, those break, so you still want to try to get your eyes on it at least once throughout the day, but you can pretty well set up a timer solenoid valve system and have this thing self-water itself. You're going to need a header line. A header line is nothing different than takes the water from your water source to the front of the field or the tunnel or what have you, and then we branch laterals off of that header line. And then you'll need your drip irrigation tube or line, whatever you're going to be using. Have had many successful growers that maybe just don't have water on the farm or close by their tunnels. Depending on the size of the tunnel, you can actually hold water. And USDA, I think it's USDA, has a really good fact sheet out there on how to collect the rainfall amounts off of that tunnel, put them into a storage tank, and then be able to irrigate off of that. So there's been a lot of work done. There's a lot of information out there available on capturing water and storing water that way. But, poly tanks, depending if you have a small tunnel, a 55-gallon drum might work. These bubbles that they have here, just make sure none of these have had any bad herbicides or other bad chemicals in them that could hurt your crop. Make sure they are good and clean. And if you have a large enough tunnel and you need to haul water, I've seen many of my farmers, most for outfield production, but it can still work, buy old milk tankers that have tipped over or gotten crushed, semi-milk tankers, and they set those up around all the barns and the houses and everywhere on the farmstead, run all the water into those semi-milk tankers or water tankers, whatever they end up finding a good deal on. And you can get a lot of water. Actually, my very first farmer, when I started with Extension 28 years ago, a good friend of mine, he's since passed, but old Levi Miller. Levi Miller didn't have water on his farm, but Levi had a milk tanker truck sitting behind the barn. And when you went on to Levi's farm, all these gutters running from every house and every shed and every barn was going into that gutter. And that's how Levi irrigated many, back in those days, they didn't have the name tunnel. He was just growing tomatoes in greenhouses, but that's how he irrigated a lot of his tomato tunnels as well as his field crops. So you can carry and haul a lot of water in those semi tankers. You'd be surprised, a good inch rainfall event, how much you can collect from your house, your neighbor's house, all the barns, all the sheds, everything on your farm. So keep that in mind. Another thing, like I use on my farm, is we have an irrigation pond. It has 1 million gallons of water in it. That's how we irrigate all of our field vegetables, but we also irrigate our, when we had our tunnels, we've gotten out of the tunnel business now, but when we had our tunnels, that's how we irrigated, was out of our irrigation pond. Some of the things we need to consider though, if we're going to use ponds, creeks, or rivers, or streams, or what have you, going to need a pump. Got to get the water out of that pond into the tunnel somehow. So then we're going to have to buy a pump. Then we have to have a pre-filter. You have to have a foot valve that opens and shuts. You're going to need suction hoses and fittings. You're going to need a discharge hose that comes out of that pump. When we are using these open bodies of water, filtering is a must. So we have to, and we'll go over filters here in a little bit. That pond may be seasonal. One of my growers I work with down in Adams County here in Ohio built a big, tall, 300-foot long, 32-foot wide tunnel. Had this pond on the farm, but just like I mentioned before, once he started pumping and keeping up with the demand on those tomato crop in that big long tunnel, he sucked that pond down pretty good, and that little drought spell did not help him. So just remember that pond may be seasonal, but then you have to manage that pond. Make sure you don't have no runoff from herbicide runoff. You don't have algae growth. You're gonna have to keep the algae out. That just plug up all your filters, and then make sure that whether it's spring fed, if that spring fed can keep up with the replenishment, or if it's runoff. My million gallons is runoff, and we've sucked that down pretty good in a drought situation, but we never have run out of water yet, knock on wood. So just keep that in mind, that source isn't going to run out. Wells are good, both public as well as domestic and private wells. Most are usually good water quality. So even though you think, oh, my family's drinking that, get it tested. Get it tested before you're going to rely on that as a water source. I had one farmer had raspberries using the well from the family farm that they've lived on there for 50, 60 years. Well, the raspberry plants started turning yellow and growth was stunted about a month or two into the growing season. Kept asking questions. No, water's good. I said, I'll just go ahead. I dropped off a water test for him just to find out what was going on. Well, sure enough, the salt content, for some reason, the vein of his well had such high sodium content in it that it was almost killing those raspberries in that tunnel. And then once he realized he had never tested that well water, and what happened with the family over the years, a lot of them had heart problems and blood pressure problems. Maybe that sodium in that water was causing some issues. So just keep that in mind on both sources of water. Test it frequently because these water sources can change. Same thing on the pond, open bodies of water, test that water frequently. But you're still gonna have to filter even with these public and domestic private well sources because they can actually have some contaminants in them as well. So you're still gonna have to have a filtration system even on those, I'd highly suggest. When it comes to supply lines, depending on the size of your tunnel, simple old garden hose will work. Very cheap, very inexpensive, but not the most efficient method. Even on a small tunnel, you just get so much high friction and then pressure loss in that. So you're going to be running your pump a little bit harder using just a simple garden hose. Plus the diameter is pretty small. We like to use our regular supply irrigation supply lines like this type of oval hose. Comes in lots of different diameters that you size according to your size of tunnel that you're going to be irrigating, anywhere from a 1/2 inch up to 4 inch. Most of our tunnels aren't running 4 inch. Most are in that 1.5 to 2 inch diameter range. But having this type of supply line reduces that friction and friction loss, pressure loss due to the friction. Another neat thing, you can walk on them, drive over them, whatever, and they won't get damaged. And then when it is depressurized, these do collapse, so you're not tripping over those big inflated hoses all the time. My most experience, actually, I'm starting to use both types now, but back in the old days, 25 years ago, all you could really find was this vinyl hose, which is very similar to discharge hose that's used on any type of water pump or anything. And again, this flattens out when it's depressurized. You can drive over it. Sometimes the critters can chew on this. It's a little easier to chew through this blue vinyl hose compared to the hard oval hose that we have. But both have ultraviolet inhibitors in them. Both you can roll back up and store it in the off season if you want to do that and then reuse it. So these would be reusable compared to the drip irrigation that usually is not reusable. Regulators, when it comes to drip, is a must, and you will size your regulator to the type of irrigation tube that you're using. So you may want to have to regulate that down to 12 pounds of pressure. You may have to regulate it down to 15. You may have to regulate it down to 18. Just because you're using your standard household well system or your barn well system, most pressure tanks are way higher than that. You know, my pressure tank at my house is 60 pounds. So that means the water coming out of that hydrant is around 50 to 60 pounds. So I still have to screw these regulators right onto the hydrant or right onto the valve or wherever you're getting your water. And these will automatically reduce that pressure down to whatever the pressure requirement is for the drip line that you're using. Because if you run 30 PSI water through a 12 PSI drip line, I'll guarantee the sides of that drip line is going to rip out. It's all going to be underground and you'll never be able to fix it. So keep that in mind. You do have to use these regulators depending on the size of drip line that you're using. Filtration is so important just because of this. You know, you don't really see it because these emitters are so small, needle-sized emitters on this drip irrigation line, but all it takes is some soil or some sand or some, you know, contaminants within that irrigation water, you know, minerals, what have you, and they can easily bridge between the emitters. So in the center there is our emitter that we have in a space throughout the lines. All it takes is a little bit of junk, garbage in that water when it comes into that drip irrigation line, bridges across that emitter, and that emitter is plugged in. And believe you me, you do not want to have to try to get, it's almost impossible. I mean, you can run some acids and stuff through, but you don't want to go there. Just don't ever let that drip irrigation line plug or get anything in it. Once this happens, you've seen that picture of that cornfield at the very beginning, you're going to start seeing tomato plants or pepper plants or flowers or whatever you're growing in a tunnel starting to do the same thing as that corn. So filtration, filtration, filtration. Number 3, I want you to take home, got to filter that water. You can't filter it enough. You just can't. And really, when it comes to this happening or buying another filter or several inline filters, buy the filters. It's just going to make your life so much easier, make you money in the long run. There are, I would highly suggest, and you can talk to your irrigation folks, but there's also fittings we can put on the end of our drip irrigation lines that as we start up the system before it's pressurized, water will flow out, which would automatically flush the lines. Once we build that pressure in the line, that emitter, that flush mechanism we put on the end of the tape will go ahead and shut itself off. So then we pressurize the system. And then as we shut the system down and we depressurize again, that valve will open up. This is all automatic. So I would highly suggest I think they cost like maybe 40 cents a piece or something. I don't know what the price is today, but the price to automatically flush your lines is well worth that 40 cents. Back in the old days, again, before we had these automatic flush valves, you know, we would tie the end off and then untie it every so often. And just like I've been mentioning, you get into sweet corn harvest or tomato harvest or melon harvest, and nobody's going to go untie the drip line or unfold it or whatever to flush it out. So just to make your life easier, highly consider those automatic flush out valves that you can put on the end of each line. Lots of different filters. I learned a lot about filtration when I went to Israel and spent a couple weeks with some of the researchers, the vegetable researchers and farmers out there in the Negev Desert region. This is where all this was invented. Out in Israel is where all the drip irrigation was invented because they don't get no water. They have to utilize every drop efficiently. So I learned a lot about filtration then, and these spin filters were just getting popular in the United States, but they had been adopted by farmers in Israel. So when I came back, I learned a lot about spin filters, and that's basically what we're using. You can unscrew, you can use cartridge type filters like are in the middle there, but these spin filters, I'll show you in a little bit here. We got some disc filters and some spin filters shown, but these spin filters, just as the spinning action keeps the debris in suspension, and then they collect down in the filtration, the bottom of the filtration itself, filter itself. So all you can do is unscrew that. There's all the junk. It's in the bottom of the filter. Just spins it around those cartridges and ends up in the bottom. You unscrew that every week, every 2 weeks. Just don't forget about it again, or you will lose some pressure. And then you just clean that out, hose it out, brush it out, whatever, and then put it back together. So those do work pretty good. Will not work well on organics like fish emulsion. If we're injecting fish emulsion through our lines, the fish emulsion can actually plug up, which a lot of folks use fish emulsion for a nitrogen source, can plug up a lot of the cartridge filters in between, and then that reduces that spin movement, and it's all gunky. You pull that screen on, it's just a gunky old mess with that fish emulsion type of organic fertilizer. And it does not work on dissolved minerals either. So if you're using a fertilizer that's not 100% water soluble, you will plug these all. You'll spend more time cleaning these out than it's going to be worth. These disc filters are much better. All the gunk and garbage gets, this is just a stack of filters. So you see the blue, the red, and the yellow. Those are just a bunch of stacked filters. It all depends on the size, but they're just little plastic disc filters, and then all the junk that's coming through gets caught in between those disc filters. So then to clean them out, screw the bottom off again, take all those discs, put them in a bucket of water, flush them out good, hose them down good, stack them back together, put it back on. This works more efficiently for those organic type fertilizers you may be putting through your system. Sand media filters, they are the best when it comes to that open bodied water. Or if you're collecting the rainwater off of the roof in the neighbors' houses and everybody else's, sand media, similar to a swimming pool filter, not quite the same though. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I can buy a swimming pool filter a lot cheaper. Try it. I've seen a few folks try it. Within a couple of years, they're buying the true irrigation sand media filter. They just do a much better job. We're overworking these things compared to swimming pool filters. Swimming pool filters have great, easy lives. Our sand media filters for drip irrigation have tough lives because we're really hammering them on a daily basis. So this is just a couple pictures of one of my farmers. This is how they make theirs. This one's movable, puts on a skid, can move it between tunnels, can move it between fields. They do need to be back flushed every once in a while, and that depends on the source of water, how dirty it is, but you'll have to back flush that, but just turn the valve and it reverses everything, blows all that junk and garbage out of it. Pressure gauges, like I said, lots of ranges depending on how big your system is and how much pressure you're going to be running, but you need a pressure gauge throughout the system just to make sure you're not over pressurizing that system, because you can have lots of issues, lots of downtime and lots of money lost. Here's just a picture of these solenoids and these timers that come in many different types. Most are battery operated. You don't even need electrical source out at that tunnel. And like the one in the center, that's a 4-zone. So you can actually have your greenhouse or your tunnel in different zones, and those will kick on. These timers, you can set them up to 6 or 8 or 10, depending on the kind, different zones and different stations to irrigate with. So this makes life a lot easier, and it's really, considering the management you're going to save, pretty inexpensive materials here. Lots of plastic valves, be able to shut these off. You get a blowout, you want to shut it down real fast. This is how you do it. So you can use PVC valves, a lot of plastic valves. There's big ones, small ones, depending again on the size of your system. Brass valves are good, a little bit more expensive, but they don't break as easy. You can actually, we've driven over them with the tractors before and then break these brass valves where you can really break those plastic ones. And again, come in lots of different sizes depending on the size of your system. So with that is irrigation quick, irrigation and quick on how we can fertigate. Now, when it comes to growing our crops, Matt, is there any questions on irrigation before we roll into the crops and scheduling?
Brad, there's been a few submitted in the Q&A, which I've addressed, and hopefully adequately for the moment, but so no active questions at this time. All
right, cool. Well, we'll roll right on into the crops and scheduling then. I don't know what we're doing yet. We got about a half hour left, so I think we're right on schedule here, but I hope y'all didn't jump on the webinar today thinking we were going to lay out every crop and every schedule and every time schedule needed to grow in a tunnel. Really, with the research that lots of great folks like Matt and other folks throughout the US and the world have done with high tunnels, we have so much technology. We have come so far in terms of equipment and irrigation and the tunnel structures themselves. What can be grown in a high tunnel? 20 years ago, we were fairly limited. Today, you can grow anything, any crop, anytime you want to. Really, you can produce in a tunnel 365 days a year, any crop. I don't think I'm stretching it too far, Matt. If I am, let me know. But I think we have the technology today to grow any crop, any day of the year in a tunnel.
Well, I would like to, yeah, I'll just barge in here, Brad, real quick and say, I know we have people from a lot of different areas of the country in the conversation right now. If you are in the part of the country that experiences a true winter, like Brad was talking about the 8 inches of snow in his area, I suggest that you don't let anyone try to convince you that that it is impossible to have a freshly harvested crop from your high tunnel year round. There are exceptions, important exceptions, but there's a perception that there's a time when nothing will be able to be harvested fresh. And high tunnel production has demonstrated that amount of time is very, very small, small enough to be, if you will, negligible. So I don't want to take any more of Brad's time, but I just wanted to pile on there and say it's really a matter of choice as to whether or not you'd like to be able to go out to the high tunnel in the middle of February or January and harvest and sell something. We'll get to a little bit of that later, but for now, Brad, I appreciate being able to jump in.
Oh, no, thanks. I thought this is much different than it was when Matt and I started working on this 25 years ago. But see the last few words there? Anytime, anything, if you have enough money. It will cost you. You could grow tomatoes in the dead of February or January if you want to in a high tunnel. Do you have enough money? And then the next slide will be my last point, but I'm going to mention it now. Is it economically feasible? We can literally grow anything, anytime. Is it economically feasible? And do you have enough money to put into your tunnel system to grow anything, anytime? So just be realistic about it. And it comes down to your business plan, your marketing plan. But we'll go over that here in a little bit. But what can be grown? Anything. Really, we have always shot for high value crops in the tunnel because tunnels are expensive and we want to grow high value crops. But for lots of farmers, it may be a cheap spinach crop or a cheaper radish crop, but they need that crop during periods of time that they can't get it in the field. That it means more to them to grow that cheaper, lower value crop during those high value peak times of the season. So there are exceptions. Most farmers, though, try to get the crop that's going to maximize that square footage, both vertically and square footage throughout the tunnel itself. But there are exceptions, and you as the farmer has to determine why and what am I going to grow and how is it going to benefit my operation. We can grow lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, some of these new fruits. Dr. Gary Gow, who's my research partner and horticulture partner at Piketon, he's growing hardy kiwis and hardy figs. We don't know if that's proven yet. I think it has a lot of potential, really, but we have a lot of work to do before we actually jump into those. But any fruits, any vegetables, cut flowers. I've worked with a company out of Cincinnati on growing some hops in high tunnels, trying to extend the hop harvest season. Lots of uses for tunnels today compared to when we started this 25 years ago. Really, our goal, though, is to grow and harvest a crop earlier, later in the season, extend that harvest in the non-typical months, or just extend the harvest in general. We can provide winter protection. We can modify that temperature compared to outside within a tunnel. The temperatures typically are much warmer even on very, very cold outside conditions, those tunnels warm up a lot more in a day like today. Here in Wilmington, Ohio, it's very sunny. And I've had lots of my farmers here in the last week or so who are working their tunnels now say, it's gotten up to 80 degrees in that tunnel. And we haven't had 80 degrees here since last September. So we do warm up and can protect these crops in the tunnels a lot better. Bottom line though, if you're growing in the soil, which is a majority of our growers do grow in the soil, however, we're seeing a trend and we're seeing research. I'm currently doing some research I'll mention here at the end, along with another research partner, of not using soil, using some different growing systems. But typically we grow in the soil in these high tunnels, so don't guess soil test. We hit that home in the fields. It's even more important in these high tunnels because fertility has to be managed to a T. And if we don't know what we're starting with, it's hard to manage for the specific crops that we're growing. We do need to provide crop-specific season-long prescription nutrient management. That's a requirement. We utilize that with tissue testing through labs. We use that with quick tests, pediosap analysis tests that we do to fine-tune the nutrient prescription for the specific crop we're growing. And it varies by the crop, but if you don't manage that fertility and those nutrients in the crop, and we talked about not letting the beds dry out and not trying to play catch up on moisture, nutrients are just as bad. If we get behind, the crop's not going to show us a nutrient deficiency till it's too late. And then you're playing catch up. You could be a month out before you really know that you have a calcium deficiency or a nitrogen deficiency or a boron deficiency. And then by then it's too late. You've already thrown out a bunch of tomatoes or you've thrown out a bunch of leafy greens or whatever. So along with fertility, irrigation management and crop management is very precise prescription nutrient management of those crops. And again, managing and using pediosap analysis and quick test is another whole hour or two program we'll spend on maybe later. So really, why, what, and when do you want to extend your marketing season with high tunnels? It's only a question you can answer for your particular operation. My first thing is, why does anybody want to work harder and more? We were doing a 365 CSA on our farm, and my wife was the farmer. I just worked for her. And we did this winter thing. We were harvesting beautiful lettuce, beautiful turnips and radishes, and the boys would have to shovel the snow out in front of the door for us to walk into the tunnel, and then we'd harvest. And we had a great winter CSA. But after two years of that, my wife, whoever's your partner in your operation, they better be on board too, said, Brad, we can't do this winter thing no more. I can't be running the farmers markets. I can't be making CSA drop-offs. I can't have people coming to pick up at the farm all winter long. I need my downtime. I need to get my house back in order. I got books to do. We got taxes to do. So 365 production can be done, but is it going to work for you? Only you can make that decision, and don't get yourself into a world of hurt like I did. We got through it. We quit that once I was told to quit it, but it can wear on you. We just are seasonal farmers here, unlike California and Florida, and some of us need that off time to get caught back up. But how much do you want to invest? How much do you want to gamble in terms of dollars? High tunnels can spread the risk and investment out over the season, over the year. Will these investments make money? It determines on your own operation. You have to determine the economic feasibility of those investments and whether they're going to pay off. You do get longer income, longer market periods if you have markets for those. You can retain those customers longer by being first into the market with tomatoes or the last in the market with tomatoes. Some crops, a lot of research done out there, the crops have got much higher yields grown in a tunnel than out in field situations. On many crops, the quality is much better. But it all comes down to all of this. Is it economically feasible? For lots of farms, tunnels are not economically feasible for their operations. So only you can determine that. So when you time these tunnel harvests, consider the market size. You can get some early potatoes. Red, white, and blue potatoes on the 4th of July, you can do it in a tunnel. In the field, we can't get red, white, and blue potatoes on the 4th of July. Some small pickling cucumbers early for July or June, small baby summer squash, baby carrots, if you have some specialty markets for that. Remember, if you're gonna do the tunnel and extend your season, you've just backed everything else up. For instance, my farmers always seed, those that are doing tomatoes, seed on Christmas Day. And guess what they're doing this week? They're planting tomatoes in the tunnels this week. They seed Christmas Day, transplant up into bigger containers over the last couple months. And then the week of Valentine's Day to the end of February is when they plant the first ones in modified high tunnels, though. Those are tomatoes in heated tunnels. Just remember, the light quality and duration of that light is what's critical. We're getting light today. We're getting light now compared to, it's light out at 6:30 in the morning and it's still light at 6:30 at night for the most part now. In December, we didn't have that. So once you cut that light down, all fruiting and flowering pretty well ceases on any fruiting or flowering vegetable. Also got to watch that daytime, nighttime temperature. So again, planting tomatoes this week, you have to modify that with some additional heat sources of some types. And I'll show you some pictures here, what some of my farmers are doing. As you're growing those seedlings, like I said, my farmers keep increasing and transplanting to larger pots throughout the last couple months since December. So you don't want those plants to get root bound. And then if you're going to do this season extension thing in the tunnel, you're going to have transplants that you're going to have to keep using if you want to transplant your crop. So the timing of these transplants, always be thinking ahead. You're going to be way off from the field. You're going to be seeding things. Who seeds Christmas Day unless you're growing tomatoes in a tunnel? Succession plantings work very well in a high tunnel. That's another way to make more money. You get done with one harvest, tear it up, start another harvest. And some examples are some of the quick maturing crops. Every 10 to 14 days, you can plant arugula, plant some beans, plant some beets, carrots, what have you, for you have a staggered succession harvest. And then for some of the longer season crops, basil, carrots, cucumbers, we can plant those about every 20 to 30 days. Keep in mind determinate and indeterminate varieties, especially when it comes to tomatoes. Both those have different management styles. And again, that's another whole lesson we can talk about. But in terms of training and pruning and all of that, you'll have to base that production system on whether it's a determinate or indeterminate variety. For us in Southern Ohio here, I'd say 85% of the tunnels you just walk into, it's going to be tomatoes. My growers' experience for the last 25 years, since the first Fred Weaver was my first farmer that planted greenhouse tomatoes. And now I don't know how many we have around the Bainbridge community, but almost every house has tomatoes in it. We do have one large tunnel with a lot of specialty Holland type peppers in it. But these tomatoes, an indeterminate variety especially, can grow vertically. With the right training system and pruning, you can actually harvest a lot of fruit from that expensive airspace. Where I do have some folks that just grow ground culture tomatoes, but if you really want to maximize yields and money, harvesting from that vertical airspace will really make you the most money. But the only thing that shuts us down is the lack of sunlight in the fall. We plant this time of the year, we got plenty of sunlight to get us through till November or so. What's a modified high tunnel? These are just some pictures of some of my farmers, how they modify their high tunnels. It could be a supplemental heater, like the propane heater on the right that's brought in on a skid, on a Bobcat, just to get those plants through a couple cold nights in April or early May. We have a lot of hot water boilers being used that are fueled by wood. And they're using the fin pipe like you see down through the middle where the hot water goes down right at the bed. At the bottom of those plants, gets that plant off to a good start this time of the year by having that bottom heat more so than anything. And then the bottom pictures where now you got a little too cold, so they brought in some other supplemental heaters just to get through those really chilly nights. If they had some, like what we have coming up here at the end of the week. So I think we're gonna have a lot of these as we dip down below 0 Fahrenheit this week. Just gonna mention real quick, we haven't really mentioned a lot about fruit, but fruit research has been done in many states. Penn State, I'm going to use some of Kathy Demchek, who's a horticulturist like me, but in Penn State, they've done a lot of work on high tunnel fruit options, and it works. Much different than field. If you grow field fruit and brambles, it's a totally different ball game. You throw them into a tunnel. Trellising is the big one. Everything stretches in the tunnel, right? Because of that diffuse light, tomatoes get taller, brambles get taller, everything gets taller. So we have to modify our trellising systems, and pruning and management of that pruning and training is increased in the high tunnel. But here's a good example. Same exact berries outside in the field. Here's the ones in the same variety growing in the high tunnels. You can just see that diffuse light makes everything stretch and get a lot taller. Again, we're harvesting airspace, right? But you can actually, if you don't manage the pruning and the training, it can actually impact your yields if it gets too thick in there. It can be a jungle. Look at this picture Kathy shared with me. If you don't train these things right, it's a jungle, and you end up losing more money than you gain. We did some raspberries back in the late 90s in our tunnels, and we didn't stake them right at all, and it was literally a jungle. We couldn't even walk in there. Couldn't harvest the crops, so much rot and so forth. So you'll have to come up with some type of a good constant pruning, constant training, like we see here in this picture from out in Pennsylvania. But beautiful fruit. If you ever grew brambles out in the field, you know that that berry consists of a bunch of little drupelets or little berries. And when you get rainfall on those, in between those little cracks and crevices, that causes a lot of rot and poor quality issues. Like I said from the beginning, we shut off Mother Nature and shut off the rainfall. So we can produce some beautiful high quality fruit in these tunnels. But again, we got to manage them. See how this can get away from us, especially blackberries. They get away from us in the field. So they really get away from us in the tunnel situation. We at Piketon, again, Gary Gow has modified these rotatable cross-arm trellis systems. Actually, the folks down at Piketon built the very first one using Dr. Fumi Takeda's example. We went out and spent a couple of days with Fumi out in Kearneysville, West Virginia, and he actually made the first rotatable cross-arm trellis, and now companies have redesigned those. But we designed one with Fumi's design that we actually put into one of our high tunnels at Piketon many years ago. So that works very well. Then if we have some fall-bearing raspberries and brambles, we can actually cover them with some row cover here and extend that season, maybe up until Christmas or Thanksgiving, by keeping that fruit protected and freezing into the cold nights of November, December. Just one last thing here, and then if we have time, we'll have Matt chime in on some of his off-season work. But Dr. Cherry Kubota from the Horton Crop Science Department, me and her received some funding, and we're actually pushing the limits on these high tunnel strawberries. We've tried and tried for years. We've done them on the flat, on the ground. We've done buckets. We've done stacker systems. Just never had that home run to make strawberry production in high tunnels work. Therefore, we're looking at a new system that's being used, isn't even available in the US yet, where we're using these gutters, and then we use these substrate cubes, and we condition the plants, trick those plants day and night early on for they start initiating flower buds early. We use a nice deep cell, as you can see here, and then we plant the plants into those cubes. We got our timing off a little bit. We think we were about three to 6 weeks too late this fall. We plant on September 15th. Probably should have been more like first or second week of August. We did get yield, had trouble ripening them. This is a unheated tunnel, one of my unheated tunnels at Piketon, no lights. Had mature green fruit in November and end of October and into December, but we could not get it ripened just because of the low light levels. So we learned a lot from this. Stay tuned. We'll have full reports, and we've set these plants down on the ground now. You see here, this was early on planting, but we set these plants down on the ground now. We got them covered in row covers. We'll be bringing them back up here in about a month, and then we're going to fruit them again. So with that, Matt, do you have something you'd like to share for the last 5 or 10 minutes here?
I think I'm going to hold off on starting something new, and we'll probably just end the session with 5 minutes or so of conversation about the irrigation, fertility, cropping topics that you touched on, Brad. There were quite a few questions came through the Q&A. I tried to address them as best I could as they came through. The questions spoke to a lot of irrigation topics. One of which is, how do you find a good irrigation consultant in your area? Where would you start? Would you start with your local extension office? Would you start with, connecting with other growers in some way, such as at a co-op or a market? Where would you find the best irrigation consultant for your farm?
Actually, all the above. Pre-COVID, every state just about has a Vegetable or Fruit Grower Association and has an annual conference. We have our OPGMA here in Ohio, and we have the conference, and there's a trade show. So a lot of the irrigation companies and engineers will have displays there at the trade show. We have an organic OFA conference here in Ohio. Lots of good irrigation folks there at that trade show. So yeah, all the above. Check with your county extension office. They can help you out. Check at these conferences. We're very fortunate. We have several companies in Ohio here that can help us, but I know not all states are as fortunate as us. So yeah, I would highly suggest if you don't have a trade show where the irrigation companies can be at, check with your county extension agent first, and then go from there.
Yeah, and also, consider the suppliers that you're buying the equipment from to recommend, somebody to follow up on the use. Sometimes those suppliers actually have guides of their own that will get you started.
Yep, almost all the companies have an engineer on staff to help you design.
They may not be sufficient to optimize your entire system for your particular situation, but they can get you started if you have no one else to turn to.
Yep.
Another question that came through is consistently is, knowing how much water to apply, basically when to turn the system on, when to turn it off. What I put into the chat is that, in my view, the best approach would be to consult books like the Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers.
Definitely.
The production guide that is produced near your location in the Midwest. We have the Midwest, there's a Southeast, there's a Northeast, certainly there's a Western version and a Great Plains version. So anything to add to that, Brad, beyond the school of hard knocks and just learning from experience how your soils and crops respond to irrigation? What else would you recommend besides those books and guides and handbooks, if you will?
Yeah, there's so many variables, but yeah, I don't think, Matt, we stress enough. I find out that farmers aren't familiar with Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers. So that's Dr. Dale Kretschmann was one of my professors back in college, and he hammered home that every vegetable farmer should have that Knott's Handbook. So I definitely get one of those because that spells out approximate amounts of water that crop's going to need for its life. But it varies. It varies, especially in a tunnel, because it might be making it a little easier to manage the water in a tunnel because we don't have the additional rainfall to manage. So it varies by age of the crop, time of the year. There's so many variables. So like we mentioned, test that soil, whether it's with a finger test or whether it's using tensiometers or whether it's, there's even tensiometers now that will automatically kick on the irrigation using those solenoid valves once your moisture levels drop to a certain percentage that you set up. So yeah, we've come a long way, Matt, in that. And it's still, you're not going to be able to get rid of it, but just being down there on your hands and knees, feeling the soil is the best time to know when to turn it on and off. But it's easier to manage than outdoors because we know we're not going to get no other supplemental moisture from any rainfall in a tunnel.
There was also a group of questions that's referenced the general topic of how irrigation is also integrated with other areas that growers should really need to pay attention to. The first one is plant disease management, and the second one is preventing their crop from being contaminated with a human pathogen. So look, water is the medium of choice for a lot of microorganisms, right? So keep in mind that your irrigation water can actually harbor both human and plant pathogens. I know we have plant pathologists on the line today. We may not be able to hear from them directly, but if I'm recalling what they have taught me well, plant pathogens can travel in water, certainly, especially certain fungal pathogens and bacterial ones. So that's something to be mindful of. Where's the water coming from? Yep. Secondly, that water can harbor human pathogens. So if you're irrigating lettuce, irrigating a crop that's not going to be chemically or heat treated, and you're somehow applying it unwittingly, unknowingly, without even trying, applying a human pathogen at the same time. Be mindful of that. And that could be the rainwater catchment, because after all, birds fly over the roof and birds do what birds do. Just test the water. Reach out to an expert. Pay attention to your produce safety specialists, and there will be also a really good guide in that. But I see that we're running up towards the end of the time here, the agreed upon hour. We know we could stay for much longer. We really appreciate your everyone's careful attention. Next week will be our final session in this 6-week school. I hope you can join us for that. But in the meantime, I hope things go well. And you can, of course, view a recording of this at the YouTube channel that I will be sending out to folks as a reminder as to where all the recordings are. So appreciate the time, and I'll conclude the recording at this point, and see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.